Welcome to the Comic Sauce Podcast, where we talk comics and comics culture. I am Henry Liu, and today I'm joined by the one and only Porfirio Rangel. Porfirio, how are you doing?
Doing pretty good, Henry. Happy to be here talking with you comics.
Yes, indeed. Once again, we're talking comics. Today is July 1st, 2021, and kind of a different format today. We're going to be talking about our respective origin stories. Origin stories in that we're going to be talking about uh, our comics fandom origins. Like, what were the early things that got us into all of this stuff that we're so obsessed with now, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, this is pretty free form. I mean, it could be anything from a TV show or a movie or maybe an actual comic book or a toy or a comic shop or a comic convention. What were the important touch points here? I think on this show we talk quite a bit about what we're into, like right now. What am I watching right now? What am I reading right now? But maybe a little less. We uh, don't talk about as much the early stuff, like what are the origins of our fandom, right? So yeah, let's get right into it. Are there any particular things that come to mind, like top of mind for you, that got you into comics fandom?
Yeah, for sure. So for me, it was definitely I think it was the 1994 Spider-Man animated series.
Mm-hmm.
I just, yeah, remember watching that. I think, yeah, that was for me how I got introduced into like comics and Marvel and all that stuff. I just remember like one time got home after school, um, or yeah, I feel like after school, and I just remember like that was like I turned on the TV and that just appeared one day, and I saw this dude doing crazy stuff in a red and blue suit, and I was like, this guy looks weird, but I found out his name was Spider Man and all this stuff, and it was just awesome. Like the art and the graphics were cool. The opening theme was awesome, and the villains were really cool. Like it had a array of different villains, like Doctor Octopus, the Green Goblin, the Hobgoblin, Rhino. Like it was really awesome. And yeah, that's how, I mean, like we've talked about like how Spider-Man we both like love and identify with,
Yeah.
but yeah, honestly, yeah, it was because that early exposure. I guess like I just was able to identify it so early and grew up with it. Just me being like the small kid in the classroom and just being picked on for that, and then watching this on TV. um I was just always really, yeah, fascinated with Spider-Man, and that was my intro into the Marvel brand. That and the X-Men animated series.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Right on. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, that really speaks to the universal appeal of Spider-Man, right? Because everyone talks about the early origins of the Spider-Man character, right? The Marvel comics of the 1960s, and how at that time it was kind of a groundbreaking character that really appealed to younger folks and had this great relatability. Um, but it's cool that, like, decades later, through a different medium, through television, the character had that same impact on you, right?
Hmm.
You were able to relate to this character. And I think what you experienced is what a lot of young folks in the 60s experienced through
Mhm.
comics with the same character, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
And I would go further to say that later on with Spider-Man movies, that same appeal worked then also, right? So there's this cool evolution um, through different mediums, but bottom line is the character stayed essentially the same and had the same appeal. So yeah, I can talk about my comics origins a bit now, but I did want to go back to that, like how as the decades progress, you know, we see these different mediums shape people, right? So I think the 90s, it really was these animated series on TV. I can't tell you how many comics fans now go back to that stuff, right? 90s animated superheroes. Like
Yeah.
that was the entry point for a lot of people,
And
right?
yeah, and I feel like, Christian's not here talking with us, but I feel like I could speak for him when I say that for him also he got introduced to a lot of these like fandoms, and it was because of the Batman animated series.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I feel like as time marches on for like the next decade, the 2000s, a lot of people are going to point to movies as a big time entry point, right? That's when the MCU started up. That's when
Hmm.
superhero movies really took off, right? And then, like, for the tens, we can probably look to television again, but not so
Hmm.
much animated, but like live action, you know, as we've seen with cable and streaming services. A lot of comics content is exploding on TV.
Hmm.
Um, but for me, I'm old school, man. I'm going back to a previous decade, the 1980s, and that's where I really discovered my comics fandom. And yes, it was through comics, right? And yeah, like, yeah, it's kind of cool the way I think about it. It's really kind of like the 80s were comics as an entry point into superhero fandom. And then in the 90s, it's more so animated series, 2000s movies, and etc. And beyond, right? But yeah, with the 80s, if there was one comic series I would point to as like the entry way, it would be the Iron Man Armor Wars series. Yeah,
Hmm.
pretty cool stuff. Written by Bob Layton and David Michelini, illustrated by Mark Bright and Barry Windsor Smith. Um, I have a feeling if I reread this today, it might not be so gripping, but I really loved it when I read it in the 80s. And man, it's so long ago now, but I remember it like it was yesterday. I stepped into the Safeway grocery store in San Ramon, California, and there was one of those spinner racks there,
Yeah. Hmm.
and I saw it, the first issue of the Armor Wars series, and it was, the cover itself was pretty cool, and that drew me in. Had to get it, and I was hooked. I ended up buying the rest of the series, and as they say, the rest is history. I
Okay.
never turned back in my Marvel fandom.
Okay. I have to ask two questions. One, how much was it when you first bought it?
Oh, that is a good question. I
Do
feel
you do
like
you do you remember?
I don't remember off the top of my head, but it had to have been like $1 or so.
Uh-huh.
Let me see. I'm looking it up right now. Uh,
And okay, and then my second question is, do you still have it?
Yes, I absolutely still have that issue. Okay, here's some specifics. It's Iron Man issue 225,
Okay.
cover price $1.25.
Wow, that's like
So, I
that's
mean,
like
it's
more
go ahead.
that's like more than like half the price of how comics cost today.
I mean, I'm old, but I'm not ancient. It's not like I bought comics for like a dime. But yeah, it was, it was cheap, but there is such a thing as inflation.
Yes.
um, but yeah, uh, yeah, it's funny with Iron Man, like he isn't one of my most favorite characters now,
Hmm.
but the Iron Man character definitely holds a special place in my heart because
Hmm.
it was really through Iron Man that I got into Marvel. So that's worth talking about a little bit. I think I alluded to it earlier, but we talk a lot about like what are we into right now? Like a show just came out, we review it, we tell how much we liked it, how much we didn't like it, etc. Um, but I think it is equally interesting to talk about like these first few touch points, right?
Hmm.
Might not even be stuff we're into that much anymore. But what were those like first few things? This is one of them. Oh, and to bring it full circle, this kind of blows my mind. They are making a an Armor Wars series on Disney Plus.
They are, yeah.
They're actually doing this, and this isn't super obscure, but this is, I don't know, a fairly obscure Marvel comic storyline. Um, I'm used to Marvel rolling out shows or movies for like big time event series like Age of Ultron or Civil War. I would have never guessed that they would adapt the Armor Wars series, right? So that's how crazy things are these days. I'm still kind of shocked that they're doing this.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you that yeah, I'm shocked that they're doing Armor Wars, but at the same time, I do feel like Armor Wars is a popular Iron Man storyline, you know? Like
Hmm. Hmm.
there's also what's the other one? Demon in a Bottle.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh-huh. And yeah, I feel like, with Robert Downey Jr. gone, I feel like there's still a bunch more Iron Man stories that can be uh, interpreted with War Machine, or
yeah,
even
yeah.
or even in the future with Ironheart if she
Hmm.
appears later on.
Yeah, yep. Solid points. And it is interesting that they're doing the Armor Wars series with James Rhodes
Mhm.
because the original story was with Tony Stark.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
yeah, it'll be interesting to see what they do there. And I'm guessing it is going to be much different from the comic storyline, but we shall see. Okay, so yeah, that's cool. We listed like the very first thing. Obviously, it wasn't all about just that first thing, right?
No.
Anything else that influenced you in your early fandom days?
Um, like I said, the X-Men animated series was also another big part of it since it was on the same network, and there were a few crossover episodes with the Spider-Man series. Um, but honestly, yeah, I feel like I didn't get like my first comic, which was a reprint of the very first Spider-Man issue that my hometown, they were every Sunday they were giving you in the newspaper like the whole Spider-Man series, but like an issue, like by issue kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was like my very first like touch with comic books.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I honestly got into the comic book, like reading comic books very late, like probably like in high school. I want to say like
Mhm.
Civil War. I think was like my very first like introduction into comic books, and like some of the characters I did, or not some, a lot of the characters I didn't know who they were. Like Black Widow, Hawkeye, Hercules, Goliath. I didn't know who any of these characters were, but I knew like other household names like Daredevil, Hulk, Captain America. But it's so weird. Like just I guess just like being like thrown a big event like Civil War and having to understand like these like other characters and everything.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, obviously with you and me podcasting today, uh, the discussion will skew heavily Marvel, obviously.
Hmm.
And sure enough, so far we've talked about exclusively Marvel stuff. But with Marvel, you just touched upon something pretty interesting. You know, no matter where you are with the fandom, there are always new characters to discover, right?
Hmm.
So you're saying when you first started to read the comics, you were kind of familiar with the big names, right? But some of the secondary characters you were just getting to know. Um, and I certainly had that experience early on. Over time, I would get more and more familiar. But
Hmm.
even to this day, 2021, I'm still getting introduced to characters in the Marvel universe. It's such a vast universe
Hmm.
that I'm still discovering new characters all the time, and that is cool. Like just discovering new characters and you know discovering new favorite characters, like characters I really dig, right? That I had no idea of previously, right? So there is yet another appeal of Marvel Comics, I think.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what you're saying, and to even like in like go off what you're saying, because I grew up on like the whole mindset, being a teenager, young adult, young kid, like Marvel or you're a DC fan. So I totally like excluded myself from like being like, oh, DC, no, no, no. But so like now, obviously I know the big names like Batman, Superman, but now I'm starting to learn about like other popular DC characters like Zatanna, Constantine, Shazam, Superboy, the Teen Titans. I feel like if I didn't do this whole DC versus Marvel thing, I feel like I would have like totally knew these characters far in advance.
I are saying.
But now I'm just kind of like, me being so knowledgeable about Marvel and all of its characters. It's so exciting to kind of being like at my age and rediscovering that same love I had for Marvel, now rediscovering like the same kind of appreciation for these DC characters.
Hey, that's cool. Yeah, I dig that. Yeah, like kind of like what you're alluding to, a lot of fans can be sort of anti the other side, right?
Yeah.
And that's fine. But you might be missing out a little bit, because if you do open yourself up, you can get a lot of enjoyment from a lot of characters you weren't familiar with before, right? So, yeah, good point. Oh, I wanted to give a shout out to a couple things before we move on here. A big part of my comics fandom is my older brother, because he was into comics before I was. And probably if he wasn't into it, I would have never gotten into it, or at least I wouldn't have gotten into it at an early age, I think. Yeah, he was into Spider-Man and a lot of Frank Miller stuff pretty early on. And you know I looked up to my older brother in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no doubt that his interest in comics sparked my own interest in comics. So he's a big part of this, and I definitely didn't want to leave him out of the conversation.
Okay.
Yeah. A couple other things I wanted to make sure to call out. So in the 80s, when I really started my Marvel fandom in my teenage years, the Iron Man Armor Wars series was definitely a big comic series. The other big one I would call out in the 80s was the Punisher limited series. I really ate that up too. This was the first solo Punisher series. So, as most know, Punisher first appeared in Amazing Spider-Man and never had his own series until the 80s. And he ended up getting like an unlimited series subsequent, but it did all start with that limited series. And it was written by Stephen Grant, illustrated by Mike Zeck and Mike Fosberg. And pretty cool stuff. Yeah, there was a lot of like um, 80s gun-toting action hero stuff going on in the 80s, like Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone. And the Punisher of the 80s was like in that vein, right? He was this muscular, gun-toting badass, right?
Yeah.
And and this series had like all the appeal of that kind of stuff, right? Again, if I were to pick it up today, um, might not dig it quite as much as I did back then, but I definitely loved it back then. And again, one of the early significant points of my Marvel fandom. One other thing I wanted to call out to my local comic shop. So I mentioned I got that Iron Man 225 at a Safeway in San Ramon, California. Um, yeah, that was more of an outlier, I think, in my early comic collecting, because I did have the luxury of a local comic shop. That Safeway was in San Ramon, but I grew up in Danville, which is basically right next to San Ramon. And in Danville, California, there was a comic shop called The Land of Never Was. And I was there all the time. It was basically a second home. So yeah, I think of that Iron Man comic as like the entryway, but I definitely didn't buy like a ton of comics at grocery stores. Like what ended up happening was I ended up buying a ton of comics at the Land of Never Was in Danville. It is long gone, no longer there, and it hasn't been there in a long time. But I spent a lot of time in that shop for sure. So that was another thing, that comic shop will always be part of my comics origin story, no question. Okay, so we should probably get into movies, because I think movies for both of us are a big part of our fandom. So, we talk all the time about the MCU and more recent movies. Were there movies that you grew up with that like particularly sort of guided you into comics fandom?
It's so funny. Like the early 2000 movies, like the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man and X-Men and
Mm-hmm.
the Hulk, all those Fantastic Four.
Yeah.
I did not like any of them. I really didn't. And I feel like my first superhero film that I really enjoyed was the Iron Man film.
Mm-hmm.
I just like, as much as I said, like I knew all these big names and everything, from, yeah, like just hearing it just being plastered everywhere. But when the first Spider-Man film like was released, I was not excited for, and then when I finally watched it, I was just like, this is stupid. Like,
Wow.
I was not a big fan. Like, I thought the Green Goblin's costume was horrible. I thought Tobey Maguire was not Peter Parker. Um, Kristen Stewart was not MJ. Like, I was just like, I don't know, I guess because I was a kid. Like, I was like 6 or 7 when the movie came out. So obviously I had like a mindset of like, these are the characters how they're supposed to look like from the animated series, and this is not translating or anything like that.
Yeah.
And the same with the X-Men. Like, it was like just the X-Men in black leather suits, and I was like, where's the colorful suits? And I was like, where's Rogue with her Miss Marvel powers and all this? I don't know. Like I said, I was just very, very judgmental, and I was not satisfied with my first superhero film until, yeah, Iron Man, which was released in 2008.
That's right. Yeah. That's pretty interesting. You could argue that you are a true comics fan because arguably Iron Man of 2008 was like the first superhero movie specifically for comics fans, right?
Uh-huh.
Like that was like the birth of I don't know, fan service in superhero movies or something like
Yeah.
that, right?
Mhm.
Um but yeah, no, it's pretty interesting your experience. And we've talked about this before, like when you see a movie can really shape your perspective on the movie.
Mhm.
And hearing that you saw the first Raimi Spider-Man at such a young age, that might be kind of why you weren't totally into it,
Yeah.
because I think a lot of the appeal is of like, I don't know, like of a young adult or like maybe a teenager
Mhm.
watching that and relating to it. Maybe that relatability just wasn't quite there for you at the time. And it
Yeah.
wasn't until, I don't know, maybe you got a little bit older where you could sort of like process these kind of stories,
I
perhaps.
I I definitely feel I agree with you because I remember eventually later on. I mean, later on when I grew up, like in high school and all that, um, I still wasn't a big fan of the Tobey Maguire movies, but by that time, the Andrew Garfield movies were being released, the animated, the Amazing Spider-Man series, and I know a lot of people shit on those movies, but I love those movies.
See, that's like a perfect example of what we're talking about, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. So a few on my list. I mean, you named a couple already. So Iron Man of 2008, the birth of the MCU. I mean, a huge landmark movie. Um, but yeah, that was a big deal for me. Like, uh, there's something a little different going on there, right? Suddenly, the the superhero movie was like speaking to me like directly, and it was pretty interesting that I was introduced to Marvel through Iron Man comics, and the first MCU movie was Iron Man. So there's something about
Uh-huh.
Iron Man here. I don't know, some sort of symbiotic thing going on with me.
Hmm.
So that was definitely meaningful. The first Raimi Spider-Man was definitely meaningful too. Came out in 2002, and yeah, up to that point, superhero movies, they were a thing, but they weren't the thing, right? Um, the X-Men movie had come out. Some big time DC movies had come out. I mean, we're talking about the Richard Donner Superman, the
Hmm.
Tim Burton Batman. Um, but it wasn't like an every year kind of thing. And it wasn't like a genre onto itself. But Spider-Man 1 in 2002 hit me in a big way. Yeah, I saw it in the theaters in Santa Clara, California, and I was totally blown away, man. And yeah, just one of those moments. Yeah, I definitely like put on the list when I look at my Marvel fandom. There are a few things like that Iron Man comic, that Punisher series, that little comic shop in Danville. Definitely Spider-Man. Uh, Spider-Man 1, watching that was a big moment.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I brought up the Burton Batman. That was a big one too. That was all the way back in 1989. And I remember watching that at the Crow Canyon Cinema in San Ramon. And man, to this day, I don't know if I've been to a movie with a better crowd than that movie. And up to that point, watching movies was like the act of watching the movie, right?
Yeah.
The experience of it wasn't really a thing, right? It wasn't until that movie where I discovered, oh my God, like going to the movies isn't just seeing the movie. It's like the people you're seeing it with and the atmosphere and the event of it, right? I'll never forget my screening of Batman. It was rowdy and everyone was so excited. And yeah, like this whole idea of nerding out, geeking out at stuff, that was like a foreign concept to me, but I witnessed it that night, right? So I know what it means to geek out. And like the first time I experienced something like that was for Batman. And over time, I've discovered you can geek out in a lot of different ways. But yeah, the movie geek out is a pretty special thing, right? Yeah. What else? Any other movies you want to call out in terms of like being particularly meaningful?
Yeah, like in the early days, nothing comes off the top of my head. Like I said, Iron Man was, I feel like the earliest movie that I was like, this is pretty cool because yeah, DC I was not taking a part of,
Mm-hmm.
and Marvel I just felt was lacking. But no, yeah, I can't think of any other movie or anything.
I did have one other one I wanted to call out, and that's the Watchmen movie. And we're starting to get a little bit more recent, but this is still a little while back, 2009, Zack Snyder's Watchmen. And there were a few interesting intersections going on here. So in 2009, I had been laid off from my job, so I was unemployed for a while. And also in 2009, I went to the WonderCon, which was in San Francisco at the time. So basically, what happened was, in anticipation of the Watchmen movie, I read the Watchmen graphic novel, and I went to San Francisco WonderCon, and I went to the Watchmen premiere. So yeah, basically that whole year was like Watchmen. I was reading it, I was watching it, I was like convention going. There was a Watchmen panel at that WonderCon. So I was like sort of immersed in Watchmen, which is cool. But yeah, a few things there. It was really the birth of convention going for me. Like, I hadn't really been to a lot of conventions prior to that WonderCon. I know I had been to at least one before that, but it wasn't a thing for me. But essentially, from 2009 on, there hasn't been a year where I haven't been to a convention. I guess I should revise that, because last year no one really went to conventions, right? Because of COVID. But for the most part, yeah, since that convention, it's been something every year. And I've been like a big time convention goer since then. And yeah, like a lot of it was around sort of circled around that Watchmen movie. So the other interesting intersection is, I mentioned I read the Watchmen graphic novel in preparation for the movie.
Oh,
Up until that point, my comics reading was like kind of dead also. Like I mentioned early on in the 80s, I did collect comics or read comics. Um, that kind of died out. But yeah, in preparation of the Watchmen movie, I read the entire graphic novel, you know, which contained all 12 issues of the series, and I really dug it. And it really kind of, you know, lit a fire in my comics reading again. So not only did I become like this big time convention goer, I became once again a big time comics reader.
uh-huh.
So yeah, like that year, quite a few things changed. I think one thing that has never gone away is the movie going. Um, but that's definitely a big part of my fandom now, is the comics reading and the convention going. And that's been kind of more of a recent thing. So um, uh, the origin story definitely includes 2009, where comics reading and convention going kicked off too.
Cool. So okay, so I kind of want to reiterate my answer because okay, so I wasn't during that time of like between like the early superhero films to the Iron Man MCU film.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't big into the Marvel films, but I was introduced and exposed to a whole different other kind of fandoms. Like it was during that time I was exploring Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter.
Mm-hmm.
So like yeah, so I was definitely exploring those kind of fandoms outside of comics.
Yep, got it. Yeah, and I know you and I share a love of movies, and yeah, like I think for both of us, the consistent thing throughout is the movie watching, right?
Yeah.
um yeah, we're kind of framing this episode as a comics origin story type thing.
uh-huh.
um but yeah, the movies are a big part of it, and not necessarily like comics related movies, right?
Hmm.
So absolutely, that's a big part of it. Just movie going in general, right?
Yeah.
That's a big part of all of what we're talking about.
Uh-huh. But also like even like right now like I didn't go like you were saying like how you didn't really go to your first Comic Con until like 2008. I
Yeah,
didn't go
or
to
a
my
nine.
or nine.
Yeah.
I didn't go to my first Comic Con until like 2016.
Mm-hmm.
And even now, I'm still feel like as much as I feel like I call myself a comics person, comic fan, I'm still learning stuff every day. Like,
Mm-hmm.
when we met up and had our road trip last week, you were explaining to me all about like the whole grade scale with comics and
Mm-hmm.
all that stuff. And I was like, oh, what? I didn't know this is how it works. And, about like bargaining and all that. And
Yeah.
yeah, so yeah, I feel like, as a comics fan, you're just always still learning things every day.
Yeah, I think that's pretty cool with comics fandom, that there are so many sides to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
We've just touched upon a few of them: reading the comics, watching movies, watching TV shows. But yeah, comic collecting. There's like this whole different side there, right? And the language we comic collectors speak is totally different. It's like you need a translator for a lot of this stuff. I'm totally with you. Toys are a big one, right? Like collectibles. That's another whole thing. We talked about convention stuff.
Mhm.
That's another thing entirely, right? There are like legit comic geeks who like just don't go to conventions, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there, it's just a totally different aspect to the fandom, right? So you mentioned 2016. You must be referring to Silicon Valley Comic-Con, right? Yeah.
Yes, that was my first Comic Con, so obviously it holds a dear spot in my heart. But yeah, that was my very first.
That's cool. Um, that convention holds a special place in my heart too. I've gone every year. They've had a show,
Hmm.
and the two of us just so happen to be going to this year's installment. They're
Uh-huh.
calling it Silicon now, but it is next month, and we will be going. So that should be a lot of fun.
Yeah, we definitely have history of that Comic Con.
Yeah,
We've
definitely.
done a podcast episode at that Comic
That's
Con.
right. We did a live podcast there, and we spent a lot of time on the exhibit floor and attended a lot of panels
Hmm.
and did all kinds of stuff there. Yeah,
Yeah,
a great convention, and looking forward
yeah,
to going back.
for sure.
So what else here? Yeah, real quick, I mentioned the comics reading. So the Watchmen movie was a big part of that, where I wanted to read the graphic novel in preparation for the movie. And that just like sparked this thing in me where I'm like, oh my God, like I miss reading comics, and I loved the Watchmen graphic novel, and I just wanted to like read more. Um, Another big kind of comics reading moment for me, and this may be like slightly controversial, but it's when I started reading comics digitally. So in 2012, I got an iPad, and the primary reason for getting the iPad was to read comics. And it was something of an experiment, um, because I knew I wanted to read comics, but you know, I had started to kind of accumulate stuff as we do. So that was a concern, to just like become a hoarder. So like a way around that was to read comics digitally, right? So got myself an iPad in 2012, and yeah, I was wondering if this would really work out, if I would like it. Um, had those kind of questions. But I have to say, I really fell in love with reading comics digitally through my iPad that year, and have kind of never looked back. The reason why I say controversial is because um, it's kind of frowned upon to read
Hmm.
comics digitally.
Hmm.
The
Hmm.
big one is you really want to support your local comic shop,
Yeah.
and you're
Hmm.
basically not doing that by reading comics digitally. So I'd be the first to admit that that's true. Now, I do support comic shops in other ways, primarily through vintage comic buying.
Yes, and I'll
Right?
be the first to be like he does.
You know this. You know this.
Yeah.
Uh, but I do admit, yeah, like by reading comics digitally and not through print comics, you are kind of giving your money to corporate America rather than local shops. But I just, yeah, to be truthful, this is how I do it. And to be truthful, I really love the digital comic reading experience. So Comixology really has nailed it. And yeah, I do love it. And I haven't crunched the numbers, but I would guess that in the last 10 years, I probably have read more comics than the previous 30 years. I'm pretty sure that's the case. And that's how much I've been digging and reading comics on my iPad. Um, so, you know, you can make a dartboard out of me and call me an a-hole. But this is how I roll. Um, and again, one of these things in my like comics fandom origin that needs to be called out because technology has kind of opened up this cool avenue, like I guarantee you that had it not been for my trusty iPad, that my comics reading wouldn't be this prolific. So it's definitely part of my story. Again, I would say support your local comic shop 100%, 100%. But whatever's getting you to read comics, I say it's all good. I would also say that in addition to supporting your local comic shop, if you're reading comics, that's good shit. Doesn't matter how you're reading it, really. I
Yeah.
support it. Okay, so I was thinking we wouldn't spend a lot of time on this origin content, and I think we covered all the major things. But yeah, any last thoughts on the origin side of things?
I mean, like, you're never too old to get into comics. Let me just say that. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, I feel like, yeah, we both got into it at a young age, but like, just me sharing my love and passion with those around me and stuff, like, I've definitely introduced people and into the fandom at like different ages. And so I just feel like, comics are for anyone, and you could get into the fandom and read into comics at any age, like, there was a time where people said like that, comics are for little kids only. And how times have changed, I feel like,
Yeah.
like you got like very graphic comics, very sexual comics that you could tell are not for kids. They're
Mm-hmm.
for a much older crowd. But yeah, let me just say that like comics are for anyone. You could get into it at any age, and you may not like something that's mainstream, such as like Batman or Superman or Spider-Man, but I feel like eventually you'll find a comic that you'll like, and that's the beauty of comics. There's just a large selection of storylines.
Oh, I love that. Love what you just said, Porfirio. 100% agree. And yeah, we've talked primarily Marvel today, um, and most certainly primarily Marvel and DC. Um, but there's a whole other world of comics, kind of like what you're saying. There are independent publishers,
Mm-hmm.
and there is like more edgy kind of content. With comics, there is literally something for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned it's never too late. Doesn't matter how old you are. Doesn't matter, you know, what gender you are, what sexual orientation you are, what race you are. Like there really is something for everyone.
Mhm.
It's really awesome in that way. I would add too that, you know, we've been talking about this origin story, and I thought it might be important to point out there really isn't a right way to get into the fandom,
No,
right? There really isn't. And if
no.
there's anyone who tells you there is, that's this, it's bullshit.
It
I
really
really
is.
think
Yeah,
so, right?
yeah.
Yeah. Like I'm kind of framing it as, oh, if you grew up in a certain era, like, you know, in the 80s, it was all about the comics, in the 90s, about the animated shows, in the 2000s, the movie, like it absolutely does not need to follow like that path, right? If you got into it a different way, by no means am I saying like you got into it the wrong way.
Yeah.
There is no one right way. And that's why I think it's kind of fun to kind of trace back these origins, right? Because there are there are a lot of different entry points into comics fandom. I think it's fun to pick people's brains. You know, if you're at a convention or something, just chatting with someone you don't know, it can be fun to get to know how they got into what they're into,
Hmm.
right? Because
Hmm.
most likely it's pretty unique, you know? It's not just one way. All right. So that's the comics fandom origins. Before we wrap up, I thought it might be fun to talk a little Black Widow because we are right on the doorstep of the triumphant return of the MCU to movie theaters in
Hmm.
person, not through Zoom, not on your TV, back in actual movie theaters, a new Marvel Studios movie. So you and I are going with Christian and other friends
Yes.
next week. And yeah, I cannot wait. Now, tell me a little bit about your anticipation level for this movie.
It's very high. It's very high. Like, I don't know if I'm just excited to see the movie itself because, just early reviews have it at a good standing point. Um, I've heard, yeah, nothing but good reviews about it. Or, yeah, I don't know if it's the movie itself I'm excited for, or just like good company. Like, yeah, I'm gonna be going with you, with Christian, our other group of friends. And like, like we've been talking about in our comics origins segment that like it's about community and stuff. And I
Yeah,
feel like if you go watch a Marvel movie at the midnight premiere, it is its own little community,
yeah,
like
yeah,
it's definitely fans who understand like little Easter eggs, who understand like the reference to like a previous Marvel movie. Um, so it's like just like if you cry or you laugh at a certain scene, just like times that by like 10, because you have like a group of strangers just sharing that energy with you. And so I'm just excited to go and watch the movie. I think, yeah.
yeah. I'm with you. The excitement really is twofold. We are getting to see a new Marvel Studios movie, but for the first time in a long time, we're going to get that communal experience, right?
Hmm.
We're getting to see it together in a movie theater. And it's just been so long. It's been way too long.
Yeah.
And I guarantee you the emotions are going to be running high because so many people, definitely ourselves included, have been waiting for this, you know? Um, yeah, the movie itself, I think, should be fun, should be enjoyable. But probably more important is just the experience of it, um, recent times we've been kind of gradually making our way out of COVID. I think we haven't really officially gotten out of COVID until we've seen a new MCU movie, right? So this will be the moment. This is it. This is it. So should be great. Should be a great experience. We've talked about like all these great experiences, whether it's like turning the TV on and seeing Spider-Man animated series,
uh-huh.
or discovering the spinner rack with Iron Man 225 on it,
Mm-hmm.
or like the first time you saw Iron Man, or the first time you saw Batman with this wild crowd. Like this movie we're gonna see next week, Black Widow, might be like on a future list of like important movies in our life, right? Like
Yeah,
that
yeah.
moment, like after COVID, where we got that feeling again, that old feeling, and we got maybe a sense of comfort, that maybe everything is going to be okay because the MCU is fucking back, right?
Exactly.
There we go. All right. With that, we can wrap up the episode. This is Farewell from Porfirio and Henry.